And I want to welcome you to another episode of Beyond the Surface Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Wanda J. Evans-Brewer, and this morning I have a question for my listeners. Who's afraid of the big black wolf? Yeah, who's afraid of the big black wolf? That question surfaced in my spirit as a 30th woman has stepped forward to accuse Bill Cosby of drugging and date raping her. And what's interesting is this is a case that the woman explains that this happened to her. This incident occurred in 1968. I was born in 1967. To date, I am 47 years old, so this is a 46-year-old allegation. And so I started thinking, I said, part of my struggle with this case, and I guess on and off I'm a hop in and out of this case, because at this juncture it hasn't gone away, is that I just don't believe that a black man in America could sexually abuse that many white women, many of which were prominent. There were some other in the mix, but for the most part these have been predominantly white women, and go unpenalized. I don't believe that a black man could have his secret held. And so some of it is based off of just the structure of our country, the history of allegations by white women against black men, and the reaction by not only the community but also by the law. So I started reflecting. I said, well, let me look at the history of these sorts of allegations. So here's some things I want you to know. Between 1882 and 1968, there were 4,743 noted lynchings. These are lynching statistics. Of those lynched, 3,446 were blacks. That's 72.7%. Okay? 1,297, which would make it 27.3%, were white. And these were whites who were lynched because they were helping blacks, or they were a part of an anti-lynching campaign, and just only a few were lynched for domestic crimes. But for the most part, the other folks that were lynched were black sympathizers. And this is from 1882 to 1968. Remember, this woman put this case out. She says that this allegation happened in 1968. Okay, this is according to Charles Chestnut's Digital Archives. 2001 was the last time that the archives were updated. There were three major cases I wanted to look at. One was the Scottsboro boy case, who were 18s accused of raping two white women as part of this was during the period at about 1933 when the way young people went to another town was on trains, and they was accused, and from all accounts the women were sort of hobos, but they were accused of raping them. And this case went on for years. In fact, they have recently been the last three were exonerated 80 years after this case. And even as one of the white women stepped forward to say she had falsely made false accusations, that she falsely accused them, they still continued on to persecute these young men. Like I said, the case went on for years. Okay? Then there's the case of George Stinney, who was the 14-year-old black boy. He's the youngest person to ever be executed in the United States of America. And his allegation was that he also raped two white girls, of which he was charged in March, and he was executed by June. George Stinney was 5'1", weighed 95 pounds, and he was so small the helmet to execute him did not fit. In fact, he had a botched execution. They actually had to run the electric chair twice to kill him. His family was run out of town. He faced death alone. His family was run out of town, and literally they had to take the clothes on their back, or they were set to be killed as well. This was all based off of accusation. And then there's the famous kissing case. Okay, this case happened in 1958 with 7- and 9-year-old Dwight Thompson and his friend James Hanover. So what happened in this case was they had some friends. It was a group of friends. They ran into the friend. They kissed the friend, which was a white girl. They kissed her on the cheek. At some point, she went home and in excitement explained that she had saw her friends and that they kissed her, and thus they was accused of rape. They spent 6 days in the basement of a jail. The parents, no one was allowed to see them, where they were systematically beaten and tortured. And were it not for the NAACP, there's a civil rights lawyer, Conrad Lynn. He has an autobiography called There Is a Fountain, if you ever want to read additional information about this case. But were it not for Eleanor Roosevelt stepping in, and she finally just made a call to the governor of the state and said, look, come on, this is enough. What they wanted was actually to give them the jail time and also give them reform school. They wanted them to spend 21 years in reform school for having kissed this young white friend on the cheek, white girl on the cheek. Now, that's a lot to look at the fabric of the United States as it applies to black men, and even the hint of having any sort of inappropriate sexual encounters with white women. Okay, so then I thought about, all right, what do assassinations look like? So there are 5 top assassinations that happened in this country that everyone should be aware of. One, of course, is Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was the civil rights activist who was assassinated by Byron de la Beckwith, who was a member of the White Citizens Council. What you need to know about Medgar Evers is that he was a World War II veteran who had actually become the secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi, and he was helping to integrate the University of Mississippi, but he also was, heavily connected to fighting for voting rights, to getting blacks registered to vote, and he was literally sniped. He was shot to death in his driveway coming home. And it took 30 years after his death to get Beckwith convicted. And everybody knew. Beckwith was convicted in 1994. Everyone knew who had done this. But 30 years went by, even with all of the information, even the fact that Beckwith actually really didn't hide the fact that he did it. He was allowed to walk free. That's the value that was placed on that black man's life. I live here in Chicago. There is Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, who was killed in his apartment with a police raid while sleeping, and he also was unarmed. That assassination happened in 1968. The police raided his apartment in retaliation for a shootout the police had had with some members of the Black Panther Party, whereby 2 police officers were killed. But members of the Black Panther Party always referred to it as assassination because that was not what Fred Hampton was about. I live in Maywood. It's interesting to see his contributions, that there is a Fred Hampton Aquatic Center. He fought very hard to have an aquatic center in this area because the segregation in the city didn't allow these children to go to many of the park districts during that time, during the 60s. They weren't allowed to. And other areas where, in the lakefront was too far. So he wanted this community to be able to have a park district. I remember the Black Panthers breakfast, and where they, basically served breakfast to children, because that was part of the concept. Fred believed that you couldn't start your day good, you couldn't have great focus if you didn't have a good meal. We know that to be true. And then they also did stuff in terms of literacy. There was a lot of efforts to just sort of raise the literacy of people in the community. So in terms of Fred Hampton himself, he never shot anyone in his entire life, but he was assassinated. There's a couple that's not talked about as much, and that's Harry and Harriet Moore. Harry and Harriet Moore were a husband and wife team who were civil rights activists and teachers who founded the NAACP in Brevard County, Florida. In 1951, the couple was bombed, and both of them were murdered. That was 55 years after the bombing. The state of Florida concluded in an investigation into the bombing and found that that three since deceased members of the Ku Klux Klan were responsible. And that took 55 years for them to find that out, when in fact they, there was, who else would have bombed them? They would have bombed themselves. Like, But that was the value placed on this couple's life, that were civil rights activists and, teachers, and put this great effort to found the NAACP in their community. There is Malcolm X, who is probably one of the most prominent black leaders of the 20th century. When you think of transformation, you have to think of Malcolm X, because he rose from a prison inmate to a spokesman for the Nation of Islam. And he was a member of the Nation of Islam, and at some point, it is believed that he was murdered by one of the members, but nonetheless, what we know for sure is that years later, it was revealed that the FBI used COINTELPRO agents to infiltrate the Nation of Islam and cause tension between them and Malcolm, and they created false letters between Malcolm and the nation. So these are things that have been brought out, that the FBI and COINTELPRO worked diligently to destroy the relationships, to turn them against one another, and thus set up a climate where a member of the Nation of Islam would feel inspired, driven to assassinate Malcolm X. And then, of course, we just finished celebrating the birthday of Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, who we know who's become symbolically the face and the voice of the civil rights movement. Martin would serve as a martyr for the movement, and he was killed in Memphis by a sniper in 1968. This was while he was there to support the striking black sanitary public worker employees. When King was shot, he was shot outside of his hotel in Memphis. Escaped convict James Earl Ray was the person who confessed to the killing. King, but would later recant it. He did later recant his confession, and to all accounts, there has been much belief that there was just simply a conspiracy to assassinate King, that he was becoming too radical in his thinking, that even in spite of the fact that he was pacifist, he was supporting some of the movement that disturbed other folks, like, union movement, organized labor, that people became uncomfortable with the direction that he was taking some of his interests. I know him to have come here to Chicago and lived in North Lawndale community to fight for housing rights. So he was doing far more than just simply, preaching about we shall overcome and speaking of a dream. He was actually trying to be a part of activating portions of that dream. So here you have, 5 top black leaders and 5 top assassinations for meager things. Some of them exposed by COINTELPRO, the FBI, some of them the CIA, some of them allowed to be mistreated by the judicial system, and some of them simply taken away by fascist movement, fascist organizations. So we come back to Bill Cosby. While I don't ever want to say what someone wouldn't do, because I believe that Bill Cosby spent a time in his life as a whoremonger. I do, and that's not uncommon for many artists. It's not uncommon for many entertainers. It's not uncommon for many athletes. And there's sort of women and that are in on it. They know that they're groupies. They're hanging around late because that's what they want to happen. They seek out contact with them and expose themselves to them with the understanding that there's going to be a fair exchange, no cheating happening in this room. You don't hang out at the Playboy Mansion because you're looking for something to do on a weekend. You don't go to a married man's hotel because, you're a virgin and you're just trying to make it into the industry. You understand that there may be some exchange that has to happen. I'm not agreeing with it. I don't participate in it. I'm just telling you the reality. So while I don't believe that not guilty means innocent, I do believe that allegations do not confirm. Because you accuse someone doesn't mean that they've done anything. My biggest struggle with this case is that now you have 30 women who have stepped forward after the time where any sort of real punishment The statute of limitations is gone. It's a wrap. If I told you the last one was 1968, the statute of limitations is over. They have stepped forward when the limitations was over to say that something happened to them without a police report, without a rape kit, without a team of people to say, yes, if you look back into this diary or these documents, you can see that these things occurred, that this person went here and there telling people. No confessions, no major confessions ever happened. And the systematic attack on this character. So while I don't believe that Bill Cosby is innocent, I refuse to believe that he's guilty given the culture and climate and treatment of black men in this country. I just don't believe that this man could date rape this many women and go unpunished. Who's afraid of the big black wolf? Who's not going to tell on this big black wolf? When you read the story of the three little pigs, each little pig goes next door and tells the other pig about the wolf that blew down their house. They at least do that. There is no trauma big enough to hold this level of secret. Who could hold it? Who's going to hold it for who? That's the problem I'm having. So did Bill Cosby, because he was a $450 million player. When you're at that level, the sort of hands you're shaking and the deals you're making and the trouble that you can get in and the people that you can offend, it's a whole different other ball game. And now the way media works, if we put your picture up there long enough and run it long enough, the general public begins to believe that you did it just because your picture is attached to the information. I don't know who he pissed off. I don't know who he has angry. I have no idea. I know that I'm uncomfortable with this case because I'm saying there have been women that fought through just tremendous trauma to at least tell us all. Children who have stood up against parents, family members, teachers, to just tell us all. And no one told it. And I'm not talking when you get people that said, oh, they mentioned he was a bad man. That's not the same as standing up and advocating on behalf of yourself and taking a serial rapist, date rapist, down. So I asked my listeners the question. I heard one of the journalists say, and it actually wasn't even a journalist, the journalist interviewing Jay Leno, and he said, I don't understand why they don't believe, who could not believe the women? Why do we have to believe the women? What are we saying, that women don't lie? We're saying that people don't get paid off. We're saying that people don't have ill intent. What makes their voices pure? When you get to hide behind something. I would like full disclosure. In my greatest dream, everyone steps forward and we get to get a full view of what it is and what it ain't. Because these cases are open. These cases are open. You cannot tell me with a climate of lynching. Bill Cosby was born 1937. That's when he was born. So he was born in the midst of that sort of hate and evil, where there was kangaroo courts. You get in trouble. They give you a quick trial. You given a staunch penalty. I cannot believe that he could have pulled this off this long without being exposed. Even John Wayne Gacy got exposed. Even John Wayne Gacy got exposed. A serial killer got exposed. Even Richard Speck, when he was here in Illinois, getting it supposedly serving his penalty for having killed several nurses, tortured and killed several nurses. And we found out that Richard Speck he had a male lover, and he was getting hormones to grow breasts. Even that got exposed. Who's afraid of the big black wolf? I want you to think about that. And it's a lot to think about. And we need to be critical in thinking about this and not completely put our foot in the sand. We shouldn't say we're for it. We shouldn't say, okay, Bill Cosby, it's clean. But I would be hard pressed to say that this case is clean and pure and the women stand spotless. I struggle with that. You've been listening to Beyond the Surface Radio. And I'm your host, Dr. Wanda J. Evans-Brewer. And if I haven't done anything this morning, I hope I've opened up your mind to be critical and your heart to consider that there may be more to this than even the eye can see. You've been listening to Beyond the Surface Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Wanda J. Evans-Brewer. Until we chat again, be safe in God's grace.